Welcome to Midnight Mysteries. If you feel like listening to a horror story, you're in the right place. Let me know what you think in the comments. Enjoy listening. On the horizon, the sky was dark. Dark as the omen of a storm that announced itself different from all others in the memory of the citizens of the small town of Shadows Cove. The town was the only human outpost on a small island and had always been accustomed to the fury of the sea, although its inhabitants had never witnessed such a threatening sky as that late afternoon. The islanders were people forged by generations of fishermen, sailors, and lighthouse keepers. Yet they watched with apprehension as the black clouds approached, feeling this time in their depths an unease that went beyond the fear of a simple tropical storm. In fact, the small town seemed almost to be holding its breath. The streets, normally sparsely populated, but usually animated by the laughter and chatter of the elderly inhabitants, were completely deserted, as if every soul had intuitively perceived the need for shelter. The doors were carefully closed, the windows barred, and the boats pulled ashore with an attention that transcended the usual practice. There was something in the air, an electric tremor, that instilled a more than palpable tension. The town had developed over the years around its lighthouse, an ancient structure that had been there for centuries and had guided countless sailors to safety through storms and fogs. Its keeper, Alex, a man whose life had been intertwined with those walls as much as the town's fate with the sea, watched the horizon with an anxiety that furrowed his brow. He, too, like the others, had witnessed many storms in the past, but nothing that could compare to the aura of threat this one carried. He almost felt a weight on his chest, as if it were an omen he couldn't shake off. Clara, meanwhile, a young historian who had recently arrived on the island to study its ancient legends and sea myths, perceived all this electricity in the air as a powerful call. She had spent months listening to the old sailors of the island and reading everything available, internalizing stories of ships and storms and treasures sunk due to the whims of the sea god. But what was beginning to materialize before her eyes seemed to challenge every story transcribed in her notes. Fascinated and at the same time frightened, she walked through the narrow streets, observing how the community responded to the approaching danger. In her, a sense of bewilderment grew as she tried to understand what was about to be unleashed upon their small reality. Families, meanwhile, gathered in their homes, with dim lights barely breaking the darkness that was thickening in the ever-darker sky. In their eyes, a mixture of fear and determination was readable, a legacy of those who had learned to respect the sea and its whims. Despite the fear, there was strength in the community's unity, a tacit agreement that, whatever that night brought with it, they would face it together as they had done many times in the past. After all, it was a small community, and they all knew each other by name. They were a kind of large extended family. As she walked, the air grew heavier and more humid, while the first lightning bolts tore the sky, followed by thunder so powerful that it made the window panes shake. The inhabitants, now sheltered in their homes, watched through the cracks in the closed shutters, their hearts beating in unison with the increasing rhythm of the rain that began to fall, first cautious, then increasingly insistent. With the arrival of night, The storm hit the town with a violence that far exceeded any prediction. The lightning bolts split the sky with an almost supernatural ferocity, illuminating for fractions of a second landscapes that turned into dramatic scenes. The following thunder was so powerful it seemed like the roar of some ancient angry deity, and made the foundations of the houses and the very ground they stood on tremble. The rain fell incessantly, and had already turned the streets into small tumultuous torrents that swept away everything in their path. Some trees from the small hill overlooking Shadow's Cove were uprooted by the force of the water and dragged dangerously down into the town's center streets. The inhabitants, now barricaded in their homes, watched all this with fear and disbelief. Families clung to each other, seeking comfort in their closeness, while their homes almost trembled under the fury of the elements. Meanwhile, in the lighthouse, Alex remained at his post like a solitary figure against the chaos unleashed by nature. Despite the temptation to seek refuge in the more protected and internal part of the structure, he knew his duty was to keep the light on for anyone still at sea on that terrible night. Every time lightning illuminated the sky, he cast anxious glances toward the horizon, looking for signs of ships in distress, even though deep down he knew perfectly well that no vessel could survive such fury. Clara, meanwhile, had arrived at the village's old inn near the beach, one of the town's most solid and ancient buildings, and it was there that she had decided to take refuge. Around her were people who had preferred to face the events of that night together, perhaps accompanied by a mug of beer and some old pirate or hidden treasure stories. The young historian listened, captivated and fascinated, rereading in their tales a deep connection with the legends she had studied. It was as if the storm was awakening not only fear, but also the collective memory of a community steeped in myths and memories. It was in an unexpected and unsettling pause in the wind and rain that a different sound was heard, almost muffled and muted by the roaring storm that resumed with renewed intensity. A dull boom, followed by a vibration that propagated through the ground and air, as if something enormous had hit the coast with all its force not too far from where they were. The inn's patrons tried to peek out the windows, but due to the adverse weather conditions and possibly a few too many mugs, they could see nothing but a wall of water and wind. In the morning, when the storm had finally subsided, leaving behind a desolate scene, the inhabitants discovered with astonishment and terror the origin of that sound. An ancient wreck of a sailing ship lay on the beach as if it had been spat out by the jaws of the stormy sea. The superstitious inhabitants of Shadow's Cove could not consider its unexpected arrival, on a night already marked by the fury of the elements, as a mere coincidence, and began to make the most absurd conjectures. So it was that while the first rays of the sun struggled to pierce through the residual storm clouds, a small group of inhabitants, driven by curiosity, approached the wreck deposited on their beach overnight. Among them was Clara, whose thirst for knowledge and adventure always pushed her beyond the bounds of prudence, and Alex, the lighthouse keeper, whose life had been marked by the sea and its mysterious legends. Accompanied by some fishermen and volunteers, armed with torches and improvised tools, they approached the wreck and began to circle it. It seemed impossible that such a beast had been brought up from the ocean floor by that storm. Yet, It was there before their eyes. It lay on the sand with its dark, time-worn timbers telling stories of distant voyages and 1,000 storms faced. The masts were broken, and on the deck, an incredible amount of debris could be observed. The ship's structure, despite its evident age, maintained an aura of majesty. On the aft part, one could glimpse what might have been its name, but the only letters that could be read were an I, an R, and an A. The rest was completely illegible. Using an old rope and wooden ladder, the group managed to climb onto the deck, not before the last of that curious bunch had risked breaking their neck due to the rotten wood of the ladder. Once on deck, the scene was not much different from what could be glimpsed from below. Destruction and debris as far as the eye could see, ropes, wood, old rags that could have belonged to ancient sails, all mixed with pools of water, algae, and incrustations. Even an octopus, hiding in a hole in the planking, scurried away at the sight of the first people that ship had seen, perhaps for centuries. Clara, with curiosity surpassing any sense of danger, bent down to pick up an old sextant with a corroded but still readable surface. Alex, watching the still agitated sea, couldn't help but wonder what force could have driven such a relic of the past to their beach. Determined to discover more, the group ventured into the bowels of the wreck. The air inside was stale and foul, filled with the smell of rot and brine that choked like a noose. The torches barely lit the narrow corridors, revealing cabins and rooms that had surely been inhabited by men once. In one of these rooms, they found a wooden trunk, now rotten but still closed. Driven by curiosity, they forced it open only to find inside tattered clothes immersed in a kind of foul-smelling brine and some personal items, including a faded portrait of a woman holding a newborn baby. Continuing the exploration, they reached the captain's cabin. It was Alex who pushed open the door, which creaked ominously, revealing an interior that had surely seen better days. In the cabin, among illegible nautical charts and destroyed navigation instruments, they found what was probably the ship's logbook. The pages were swollen and stained by water, still bearing traces of writing, but completely unreadable. Unable to glean anything from that diary, the group decided to continue exploring the wreck, but at that point, perhaps due to the stench of decay or a sense of claustrophobia, their spirits began to grow uneasy. They didn't confide it to each other, but each of them was as tense as a violin string, ready to snap at the first sign of strangeness. After all, the atmosphere was becoming heavier, almost oppressive, as if the air itself was trying to repel them. Alex, for instance, who had spent a lifetime at sea, felt the cold breath of adventure on his neck, but also the whisper of an invisible danger. Clara, despite her natural inclination towards mystery, began to sense that what they had found might be something more than a mere wreck. As the group of inhabitants, led by Clara and Alex, delved into the shadows of the wreck, a subtle change in the air foretold the horror about to be unleashed. The daylight, which had so far struggled to penetrate the ship's cracks, seemed suddenly to retreat, as if swallowed by the growing darkness in the ship's belly, and the silence became charged with anticipation. They arrived at the hold where, almost hidden behind a large crate, they found a sailor, Or perhaps it would be better to say they found what was left of a sailor. His clothes were reduced to rags, clinging poorly to his decomposed body. The uniform, which he had once proudly worn, was a collection of tattered and faded fabrics, stained with salt, algae, and in some places, dark stains that resembled dried blood. The jacket, which had probably once been a deep ocean blue, was now a shredded garment with frayed and worn edges, as if chewed by currents and deep-sea fish. Even the buttons, which had surely once been shiny and golden, were corroded by rust or missing, silent witnesses to battles against the elements and a long stay in the ocean's depths. The pants, also part of his uniform, were now just a hint of what they had been, torn and rendered almost unrecognizable by the combined action of salt water and time. The shoes, presumably sturdy sailor boots, were reduced to little more than the shell of their original shape, worn down to reveal the deformed bones of the feet. On his head, the remnants of a kerchief, once used to protect from the scorching sun at sea, now lay like a pale and torn stain, tied around a head from which tufts of decayed hair hung. The movement was almost imperceptible, a slight creaking of bones and rotting wood. But then, with a spectral slowness, that individual rose from the dark corner of the hold where he had been until moments before. The sailor's skin, where it still clung to the bones, was a pale, translucent blue. The eyes, now just two black cavities, stared into nothing, and the mouth opened and closed, moaning as if prey to an ancient hunger. A muffled scream rose from the group as the figure advanced with jerky movements toward us. He was not alone. Others followed, emerging from the shadows of the hold like ghost ships from the fog, each bearing the marks of what had been their lives, but especially their violent deaths. The bodies were swollen with seawater, the limbs contorted in expressions of eternal torment, the faces consumed by centuries in the open sea, yet still terribly expressive in what seemed a homicidal madness. There were four, advancing slowly towards us, dragging their feet on the rotten wood of the ship and emitting moans from what was left of their mouths, which continued to open and close compulsively. It was at that moment that a hand grabbed Alex's calf with a powerful grip. It was a fifth sailor no one had noticed because he lacked both legs and was crawling on the floor, approaching from the side of the other four. Alex screamed in fright, but fortunately had the presence of mind to kick the head of the creature with his other leg, sending it back a few centimeters and making it release its grip on his calf. Terror spread among the inhabitants of Shadow's Cove like wildfire. The curiosity that had driven them inside the wreck quickly turned into a desperate fight for survival. A young fisherman, too slow to react, was the first to fall under the insatiable hands of one of the zombies. With a horror surpassing all imagination, the group watched as one of the undead sailors pounced on the young man's body, tearing the flesh from his neck with teeth that seemed more akin to those of fish than men. The blood, alive and red, mingled with the briny water still dripping from the zombies' bodies, creating dark red puddles on the ship's rotten wood. The sound of tearing flesh and the young man's desperate moans filled the air like a desperate chorus marking the beginning of a ruthless hunt. Alex and Clara, driven by a primal instinct for survival, pushed the survivors towards the exit from the hold. The zombies, slowed by their meal, managed to escape, retreating to the ship's deck and subsequently lowering themselves to the beach in the most disparate and desperate ways. In the chaos following their escape from the wreck, the inhabitants found themselves fighting for their lives and against the unimaginable horror they had unleashed. The high sun in the sky only cast a harsh light on the scenes of terror unfolding on the beach, transforming it into a macabre stage for a drama of survival and death. The zombies, once confined to the depths of the wreck, had now laboriously destroyed part of the ship's hull and were pouring onto the beach, driven by an ancient hunger. Their figures, marked by centuries spent in dark waters, advanced with a slowness contrasting with the frantic desperation of their attacks. The first confrontation was brutal. A group of inhabitants, hastily armed with fishing gear and improvised tools, convinced they could quickly put an end to this tragedy, found themselves face to face with the resurrected attackers on the line where the wet sand met the first waves. The improvised weapons, however, proved tragically inadequate against those beings. A man, courageous or perhaps simply driven by desperation, charged at one of the zombies with a harpoon. The blow, which would have surely stopped a living being, did little more than stumble that monstrous creature, which responded with a frightening aggression that made the man stumble back in terror. Its hands, ending in nails turned into real claws by the long stay in salt water, struck the man, tearing away chunks of flesh with chilling ease. Soon the man was surrounded by the remaining sailors, who disemboweled him in a disgusting manner amidst the chilling screams of that poor victim. Panic spread among the inhabitants like a fire in a dry prairie. The screams of terror and pain mingled with the sounds of battle, creating an infernal tumult. The beach was now the scene of an apocalyptic spectacle, where the blood of the living mingled with the wet sand, and those monsters continuously sought new victims. The group of survivors, panting from the run, regrouped on the beach, trying to figure out what to do as the setting sun painted the sky a dark red, almost reflecting the bloodshed inside the wreck and in the first attacks on the shore. The horror experienced among those ancient planks of wood had left an indelible mark on each of them. The violent death of the young fisherman, the bodies of the resurrected sailors moving with brutal hunger, all this had shattered the peace of their existence. Now, as they faced the reality of the twilight enveloping the town, the understanding of the true horror that had struck them began to settle in their minds. At that moment, one of them, Jonathan, observing the sea, shouted something to the others. Those beings were slowly emerging from the depths of the sea as well, and in a few minutes, the number of those rotten beings on the beach had practically tripled. They were sailors whose lives had been cut short at sea and had now returned with an insatiable desire for violence and revenge. Alex and Clara, at the center of the group, shared glances loaded with a mute question. How could the dead have returned to walk the earth? Clara's theories about ancient curses and forgotten rituals seemed more terrible and real than she had ever thought or imagined. Alex, for his part, found himself reconsidering every sailor legend he had always dismissed as superstition. The reality of their situation was crushing and without appeal. Not only did they have to face the grief for the lost companions, but also prepare for a threat that surpassed all human logic. The sea, which for time immemorial had been considered a source of life and sustenance for their community, had turned into an enemy, an abyss from which inconceivable horrors could emerge. As the evening wind carried with it the salt and the cold of the ocean, the battle for existence had just begun, and every soul on the beach knew that the fight against the awakened horrors would require every ounce of courage and cunning they could muster. The number of those undead was increasing visibly, so they decided to run towards the town to warn everyone to stay indoors and not to go out for any reason. Fortunately, many houses were still barred from the previous evening, so the operation was not too complex, and those who couldn't secure themselves quickly rushed to the inn where Clara had spent her night listening to the old sailors' stories of the island. Old Samuel, known to all for his past as a sea wolf, his gruff character, and his bad leg that forced him to walk with the aid of a cane, was making his way home along the path that skirted the beach, completely unaware of the danger lurking in the shadows. His gait was slow and labored, and with each step, the wood of the cane sank into the damp sand with a dull sound, while his weak leg dragged with difficulty, leaving an uncertain furrow on the surface. Samuel muttered to himself, complaining about the fate that had condemned him to a life of limitations after years spent on the open sea. It was then that two figures emerged from the shadows of an alley. They moved with an uncertain and staggering gait. Samuel, unable to comprehend, stopped, thinking they were the usual group of idlers and drunks who always hung around that area. Holding his breath, shifting his eyes to the figures advancing in a shambling manner towards him. When the light revealed their deformed features, ravaged by centuries beneath the waves, Samuel tried to back away, but his leg failed him. A sharp pain reminded him of his limitations. With a cry born of desperation, he brandished his cane like a weapon, ready to defend himself. The two zombies, undeterred, continued to advance. One of them, with a face partially consumed by time and the elements, emitted a horrible groan, exposing rows of black and sharp teeth. The other, its uniform now little more than tatters, extended its arms toward Samuel, fingers ending in claws eager to tear and rip. Samuel managed to strike the first zombie with a well-aimed blow from his cane, sending it back a couple of meters with a wet sound of flesh tearing. But the action cost him dearly. The pain in his leg intensified, causing him to lose his balance. As he fell, the other zombie pounced on him, its hands as cold as death itself, trying to grasp and drag him away. In a desperate attempt to defend himself, Samuel screamed, using the cane to keep the assailant at bay. But the attack was relentless, and for every blow Samuel managed to land, it seemed the creatures felt no pain, driven only by the hunger that animated them. The struggle was desperate, an old man against the merciless forces of death that had awakened. Samuel fought with the ferocity of someone with nothing left to lose, but against the dark tide that had invaded Shadow's Cove, even the courage of an old sea wolf might not be enough. Meanwhile, Clara, moving quickly with anxiety and fear pumping through her veins, made her way through the narrow streets of the town, headed for the island's lighthouse to meet Alex. They had agreed to meet there during the frantic moments when they fled the beach, before their paths diverged with Clara returning quickly to her room to retrieve a few things she deemed essential after the horrifying scene she had witnessed. Alex had suggested the lighthouse because, for him, it represented his safe harbor, and he considered it not only an impregnable fortress, but also a place from which to more easily monitor what was happening in the town. Thus, Clara knocked forcefully on the heavy iron door of the lighthouse, and Alex, who had been waiting for an hour, quickly opened it, letting her in while just as quickly closing the door and sliding the heavy bolt. Alex's face was marked by fatigue and the events of the day, disheartened by the thought that no action could confront the looming threat over their community. Clara, on the other hand, was simply terrified by the fact that she had seen events incarnate before her eyes that she had studied for years as folklore and local legends. They had found each other at the beginning of this adventure, and now it seemed natural to continue together in this world, rapidly transforming into something dreadful. Instinctively, they believed that only by combining their knowledge and resources would they have any hope of understanding the nature of the threat and trying to find a solution. In the silence of the lighthouse, with the noise of the sea still unsettled from the previous day, Alex began to speak of marine legends he had always considered mere stories to scare children, tales of dead sailors and ghost ships that now, in a terribly real way, seemed to be the key to understanding what was happening. Clara, for her part, tried to bring her experience built on books with theories of ancient cults that suddenly took on a new and unsettling meaning. They both knew the path they were about to undertake would be fraught with danger, but the determination to face the darkness, to protect not only their lives but also those of the inhabitants of Shadow's Cove, somehow spurred them on. In the dead of night, they began to plan their first step, which would be a thorough investigation into the origins of the wreck and the dead sailors it had brought with it. Their idea was that the answer to the insane events of the morning might lie deep in the past, hidden among the forgotten folds of the place's history, and perhaps even in the dark legends Alex had always dismissed as mere fairy tales. They were ready to delve into the secrets of the sea, aware that every truth discovered would bring them a step closer to understanding the nature of the horror that had awakened those monsters, but also a step closer to the danger those very truths might represent.